Thank you, Vishelli. Welcome, everyone. The least you need to know about how to develop a portfolio of innovation in 18 minutes. So I want to talk about the difference between invention and innovation. Invention is when you take cash and you convert it into an idea. If you look at the inventor of alternating current, it cost a lot of money to invent alternating current, and yet at the time when Tesla invented this, there was nothing you can plug into it. So it was very expensive for him to invent this. However, if we take an idea and convert it to cash, that is in fact innovation. And what Edison did by making the light bulb, it was innovative because it came with a sustainable business model that people were willing to pay for it because it did improve the quality of their lives. So quick review, invention is converting cash to an idea, but converting an idea to cash, that is innovation, and that is what we're talking about today. Okay, now what is innovation? I'm going to give you an analogy. Innovation exists outside of labor inputs and capital inputs. If a company simply spends more money on better machines or better equipment, it might improve their product service offering, but that is not innovation. But if you're able to have the same amount of labor input and capital input and yet improve your product offering, that would be an example of innovation. And we use weather as an analogy. Imagine a farmer, year to year, uses the same amount of seedlings and the same amount of labor harvesting his crops, but year to year, the yields might be different. Well, that's because what differs year to year is the weather. And with good weather, the farmer will have higher yields, and in poor weather, the yields will be less productive. However, the weather exists independently of the quality of the seedlings and the quality of the labor doing the planting. So of course, innovation is not the weather, but it is analogous to the weather. And if you look at this formal equation, it shows how innovation actually pulls out capital and labor inputs. Now, this 18-minute talk is really based on an innovation matrix. And if you look at the matrix, we have innovation separated into three different categories. There's core innovation, adjacent innovation, and transformational innovation. And if you look at the y-axis up on top, we're talking about existing markets. Then as we go lower, adjacent markets, and then at the bottom of the y-axis, we have entirely new markets. And on the x-axis across, we go from existing products to adjacent products to entirely new products. So here, this methodology takes innovation and it categorizes them into three different levels. Again, core, adjacent, and transformational. Now, if you look at a company's income statement, often a company will have a separate line for their research and development. And a typical budget allocation for their R&D budget would be 70% of that budget would be in core innovation, 20% of the R&D budget will be in adjacent innovation projects, and then 10% in transformational. This is a typical budget allocation and one that Google actually uses. Now, this is the distribution of the R&D budget, but let's look at the distribution of returns. What we find is that the return ratio is inverse of the resource allocation ratio. So even though we're putting 70% of our R&D budget in core, we might exhibit aggregately a 10% return on investment. And yet in transformational innovation, where we might only put 10% of our R&D budget, we could see aggregately over time with various transformational innovation offerings, a 70% return on investment. Now, different industries might have different mixes. So if you're looking at a consumer goods company, perhaps Procter & Gamble, we might see 80% of that R&D budget going into core innovation projects and only 2% in transformational. Now, if we go to a mid-stage technology firm, because in technology the product life cycle is severely compressed, because in the technology industry a product can become rapidly obsolete. In that industry, we might see only 45% of the R&D budget in core innovation projects, and yet 40 and then 15% in adjacent and transformational innovation projects, respectively. Now, we frequently see new and improved. And what we will see is that most companies do focus most of their R&D in innovation projects that are about new and improved. That would be a core offering. When you see new and improved, it's really an incremental improvement. We might see a slight uptick on margin. However, new and improved will usually cannibalize the revenue without growing it. So if we're used to buying a soap that we like and now we see new and improved is pretty much going to replace the previous product offering. So we might see a slight uptick in margins, but then over time, the margins will return since the revenue will simply cannibalize itself. So this is an example of little ventured, little gain, and then the product life cycle repeats itself. But I think we'll agree we constantly see new and improved. So it's a very short-term improvement. Okay, now many companies will say we want transformational innovation. In fact, that's what many companies say. However, most companies are not necessarily set up for transformational innovation because transformational innovation requires a different structures and different processes. And that is why most firms are really set up for core offerings. Now, how to sell this matrix that we showed in the previous slides to your boss? Why separate all the projects according to these three categories? Well, the way to pitch it to a boss is, well, risk management. If you have all of your innovation dollars in core offerings, well, that is a risk to long-term growth. Adversely, if you have all of your R&D in transformational innovations, well, you may run out of cash flow to keep your lights on, so that is also a risk. A second advantage of this matrix, separating your innovation projects into these three categories, is that you could time new initiatives. If you have all of your projects in the first quarter, you may strain your resources. A third advantage is visibility. How nice would it be for your executives to have one sheet of paper where they get a bird's eye view of all the innovation going on within their company? And then fourth, synergy. You may have 9 projects on this new portfolio of innovation matrix, and you might decide that half of those projects requires the same type of coding. And now you could simply synergize that one resource across these 4 projects. Now, let's look at a portfolio of risk. If we are too cautious, that is a risk. And if we actually take on too much risk, that is also a risk. An example would be in the typical 401k plan. If we are so risk adverse, we keep all of our money in cash, over 30 years, that cash will have a negative return on investment against inflation, so we might not have enough money to retire. Conversely, if we put all of our money into high-flying stocks that have the highest risk and highest possible return, well, we might lose all of our money. So by using this portfolio of innovation matrix, we assure that we have a well-balanced portfolio of innovation where we're not being too cautious, which has inherent risks, and we are not completely transformational, where, again, that also has its inherent risks. Now, core innovation, let's give some examples. Nabisco came up with the 100-calorie packet of Oreo cookies. Now, that's an example of a core innovation because essentially it's the same cookie, but it's packaged in 100 calories. If you look at Dow AgroSciences, they had a pesticide that was previously in powder, and people had to mix it themselves with water, and then they introduced it in a liquid form. Again, it's a slight reformulation, so that is an example of core. And then replacing shrink wraps with pallets to reduce shipping cost. So these are examples of companies drawing upon assets they already have, and these are examples of core innovation offerings. Now, transformational, we have 3 examples. There might be iTunes. When Steve Jobs came up with iTunes, he really developed an entire new ecosystem. Tata Nano came up with an automobile that cost approximately $1,600 in India, and for the first time that introduced the automobile to an entirely new market. And then we have Starbucks. In 1979, they really took coffee and they changed it from a commodity to an experience. So these are three examples of transformational innovations, and they call upon unfamiliar assets and entirely new knowledge, skills, and abilities. And what makes them transformational is, how do you communicate a product that has no historical data points? That's why transformational innovation has the highest risk correlated with the highest possible return on investment. Now, adjacent innovation is somewhere in the middle, and we might look at the Swiffer, which is essentially a mop attached to a stick. Now, a core innovation might be a sponge that has higher absorption. Example of a transformational innovation might be using nanotechnology, where a countertop is entirely self-cleaning, that you don't even have to clean it because it cleans itself. But adjacent would be somewhere in the middle, where we take a sponge and we attach it to a new technology, which is essentially a handle. Now, let's look at startups and companies teething on bankruptcy. What might be the good mix in terms of an R&D budget among core, adjacent, and transformational innovation? Well, for a startup company, remember, there's no core innovation to build upon. So a startup is going to more heavily rely on transformational innovation, which is the whole reason why they are a startup. And a company that's teetering on bankruptcy, well, they might wind up shifting all of their research and development dollars to transformational innovation, because they really have no choice. Either they have to come up with something entirely new, or they will go bankrupt. So again, quick review: startups have no core offerings to build upon, so they will be leaning more towards transformational innovation. And of course, a venture capitalist will only give money to a startup if the reward premium matches the risk. So startups are going to lean heavily to transformational, and as that startup matures into an S&P 500 firm, they become more mature, more to lose, so these companies will want to protect itself more by readjusting their R&D budget more towards adjacent and core innovation. Now, how to be transformational? Well, to be transformational, you want to invite people to your meetings that have quote-unquote no business being there. I've worked with companies where we might have an ops review meeting, but for 20 minutes we'll have a special guest, and we'll make it an occasion where we might invite people that work in janitorial services, people that work in the loading docks, people that normally would not be a part of that operational meeting, because they can offer an entirely new perspective, and clearly they have no assumptions to build upon. So we also want to bring in designers, cultural anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, and any fringe and subcultures that could really look at what we're trying to offer from an entirely new perspective. Now, how do you fund all these categories? Well, for a core and adjacent efforts, you could basically fund these projects through the normal profit and loss, through your normal P&L statement, through the normal budget cycle. But for transformational efforts, those require sustained and major investments. And often they're funded through an entire separate legal entity to isolate the risk, where a parent company will create a subsidiary, and that parent company will own 100% of that subsidiary, but the risk is isolated, so if the subsidiary were to ever be sued and whatnot, as its own legal entity, the risk starts and ends within that subsidiary. In fact, an example would be that Merck uses Merck Global Health and Innovation Fund to isolate their risk for their transformational projects. Now, a typical projects are advanced to the next stage of funding through something called stage gate processing. However, stage gate processing would kill most transformational innovations. In fact, how could you predict, for example, the third-year sales for an offering that the world has never seen before? So you can't manage what you can't measure. So we have to come up with a way to measure transformational innovations to decide if we should continue funding them as we go forward. Now again, for core and adjacent efforts, those require traditional financial metrics that would kill off most transformational initiatives: customer data, adoption rates, price points. But again, transformational offerings have no historical data points. So stage gate processing is the intersection of economic and external metric. But for transformational innovation, let's choose the opposite. non-economic, and internal metrics. So what if the only hurdle a transformational innovation must clear to receive continued investment is that the firm will learn, not earn from it? So Google is trying to develop the driverless car. Clearly, it has not earned enough money or market share to advance to the next stage. So perhaps Google is looking at, okay, in the previous quarter, did we learn something new that we did not know before to advance this transformational innovation project to the next step? So of course firms must focus on net income, but for transformational innovation, not in the early stages. Now, what can you do tomorrow based on this 18-minute talk? Survey all non-operational initiatives. Those are all the projects that are not related to the day-to-day. Force all of these projects into the innovation matrix that we showed in the beginning slide, where you categorize them between core, adjacent, and innovation. Determine a pattern, and then facilitate a meeting with the C-level and have the C-level identify and accelerate any of the projects that are promising, and let the C-level cancel or postpone the least desirable projects. Then you readjust the innovation matrix accordingly, and then you schedule a meeting for the next quarter. Now, doing this is high visibility and low risk. It's high visibility because suddenly you're the person that has the bird's eye view of all the innovation projects going on, and you present it to your boss in one document. The sophistication is in the simplicity. It is low risk because you're not responsible if any of these projects fail. You are merely reporting on what already is. So doing this has high visibility and low risk. So if you'd like to read more about disruption and innovation, go to hravg.com, and I thank you all for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Vincent. That was really informative. Can you tell us about any other webinars that you have coming up and topics?
Oh, actually, I have a webinar on July 30th, I believe, and that is going to be on disruption. It could be from the point of view of you're a new company and you want to figure out how to disrupt traditional companies in the industry that you are entering, or from this webinar, you might learn from the vantage point of the traditional company, how do you defend yourself from a disruption? In fact, I usually give webinars on the last Thursday of every month, and hopefully some of you could join me for that.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, we encourage everyone to send in their questions now. We'll go ahead and start taking those. Here's one question, Vincent. I'm not the CEO of the company I'm working with. I'm a manager overseeing a department. Can I still use this methodology?
Yes, in fact, you have to practice using this methodology now. When you go into a leadership position, the reason why you were hired for that position is because you had already exhibited those qualities prior. So if you're working for your own department, you could view your department as if it were its own company, and your client, the internal customer, might be the bosses that you work for. So you look at what you do, how do you perform your job, and you look at how could we make this job better, done more efficiently, done quicker, done less expensively. And then you could take core improvements, which would be incremental improvements, and also you and your team could decide what might be a transformational innovation look like within our small department, meaning how might we completely re-engineer ourselves out of this job because we've innovated it so much. So you really, I really encourage people to start practicing this methodology at whatever level they work with. And if you're an individual contributor, the same thing. Look at how you can improve your job incrementally, and then look beyond how might you completely transform the way you do your job, even if it includes technology that is not yet available. At least if you're doing that, you know that you've really explored the most creative parts of you. Thank you.
Okay, great. And here's another question. What if I'm starting a new company? How can I use this?
Well, as mentioned before, if you're a new company, I do believe that you want to focus on transformational innovation because the barriers to entry for a new company are difficult enough. So if you're just going in with the core offering as a new company, it's that much harder to challenge the status quo because you've essentially entered as the status quo. But you might look at the entire industry as your competitors that you will soon compete against. You might view what they're offering within the industry as core and adjacent offerings. And during your venture capitalist pitches, during your VC pitches, you might introduce what you're offering for your new company as a transformational innovation and put your competitors in the core and adjacent innovation portions of the matrix. And that might be really good to add to a VC pitch.
Okay, great. Any other questions anybody has? Vincent, do you have any final thoughts before we end today's session?
Well, I do hope that people think about using this innovation. I've found that most people do not use it. However, I've yet to meet anyone who thought using it was a bad idea. It's simply a way to take inventory of everything that's going on. And as a final thought, I've had people use this matrix in the following fashion. They would tell their boss that they're going to survey all the innovation going on, and they would hand back this matrix blank. And that's a statement in and of itself. What they're telling their boss is that we have no innovation going on. And just by virtue of using this matrix, even if you have no innovation going on, you are forcing the conversation as to why is there no innovation going on? Is it something that we strategically decided not to do, or is it something that we merely never thought of before? So just by virtue of having this matrix, it forces to have that conversation. Why don't we have any innovation? And if we did, what might that look like?
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Vincent, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. If you do come up with any questions, feel free to send them to webinar@netcomlearning.com at any time, and we'll get back to you. And in addition, we'll be sending out a link to provide feedback on today's session, and we appreciate if you could take just a few moments to fill that out. And thanks again, Vincent, and everyone have a great day.
How many people are there?